Hey, welcome back. We are in episode 3 of our Summer Classics series, and we have a summer classic, if there ever was one, from the Old Testament.
Yes.
I should introduce myself. I'm John.
I'm Beth.
Where did Caleb go?
He's at camp.
So we went to the bullpen.
Yeah, you'll have to live without him this week.
We're going to have a lot of fun together. Looking forward to this conversation with Beth. And I know you've certainly taught the story of David and Goliath to kids.
Yes.
This is one of those stories. I think if you go to any person on the street that has any level of biblical understanding or of literacy, I think they've probably heard this story. Even if they don't, I think if you said David and Goliath, they probably know a little bit about it.
I think everybody knows about it. I actually did some research getting prepped for this, and when I Googled David and Goliath, more than biblical content, I saw small businesses and athletes that are using this story as their foundation of overcoming obstacles.
Yep, and I think that when you look at this story, how it plays in like pop culture, it appears in a lot of different places. And so, everybody loves a good underdog story. Everybody loves a good sports underdog story. One of my favorite movies is the movie Hoosiers. So we've all seen that probably. It's a good one. And you remember at the very end when, the little school Hickory is up against, the big monster of a, potential champion in the tournament and the championship game. And I think it's like the priest or the pastor in the town comes and he actually quotes from this story, David and Goliath, and, kind of encouraging them to slay the giant, which when you think about it, probably isn't a very good.
Probably not the best illustration. But.
Like you guys are the little ones, but so I think a great place to start here is just how this story is usually interpreted or applied.
Yeah, I think that people hear this story and they think of the little guy being able to defeat the big guy. And though that's a good application as far as some things go, it's so much bigger than that.
It's a lot richer, yeah. As we've been looking at these stories from a Christ-centered perspective. And so we're going to try to bridge the gospel to that as we get into this in a little bit more detail. Kind of a funny story about my kids. I can embarrass my firstborn because he's away at camp right now. David and the Giant Pickle was the VeggieTales story, and Ethan was scared to death of the Giant Pickle when he was a toddler.
That's hilarious.
So he would come out with his boxing gloves and he'd go, nobody to fight. So anyways, Ethan, that's for you, just for you as we're watching this in our living room.
He'll appreciate that,
The
John.
whole world has heard that you're scared of the pickle. So, all right, let's dive in. So kind of just to frame the context a little bit, I think it's always important to start and say, where does this story take place? So 17 comes after 16.
Right. Yeah, and in chapter 16...
Did you know that, by the way?
I did. I did know that 16 came after 17. I learned that when I was pretty young.
Good.
But in chapter 16, David finds out that he is going to be the next king.
Right.
And obviously he believes it.
Yeah.
As we see.
Right. And there's a lot to be said about just the way that chapter 16 is kind of said and told, that we have Samuel, who's the prophet who goes to the home of Jesse, and he goes through all the brothers, and the brothers don't even mention, their dad doesn't even mention, hey, there's a younger one out in the field. David is this, young, sheep shepherd, whatever guy, and he doesn't really count. And so you have this kind of vertical component, and I think you also see that will come out in this story, it'll be very obvious. David was going to be one that was patterned after God's own heart that we read in 1 Samuel chapter 13. And so now we're going to start seeing in chapter 17 some of these attributes on display.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to believe that David, who was considered irrelevant in chapter 16, becomes this picture of Christ. So I'm really excited to look into this with you, John.
Well, let's do this. Let's go ahead. We don't do this very often, but I think there are 58 verses, and I'm sure that we could do a very stirring reading of that together. But let's go ahead. I'm going to have you guys pause the video, and I'm just going to challenge you right where you are to read through all 58 verses. So hit pause. Back again. Welcome back. Hopefully that was a really good reading together as you kind of unpack this story together. So kind of to set the context, again, we were in chapter 17 looking at this. The Philistines are gathered. They have their armies for battle. They were gathered at this place called Socoh, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Socoh and Ezekah and Ephes Dammim. I'm sure everybody knows their ancient Near Eastern geography.
Yeah, I think one cliff and another cliff and a valley in between.
What's really interesting is so we do have one clue here. It belongs to Judah. So a lot of scholars would put this kind of pretty close to Jerusalem. And so this was in the territory of the Promised Land. And the Philistines have been a consistent kind of thorn in the side of the nation of Israel. And really in this 1 Samuel account. And so if you go back and you read some of the other stories from 1 Samuel, you have the Philistines taking the ark, and there's all kinds of problems that they have with the Philistines. But the Philistines are challenging now the Israelites. So that's the context. What are some other things that you kind of think about when we talk about the conflict in verses 4 through 11 that just comes to mind?
I see that. John, you put me on the spot here. Sorry, I wasn't thinking of I was going to have to do that. But I think that the people, the Israelites, they're fearful. They're not trusting in the God, the creator of the universe, who's been with them all. We've seen so many trials that God's pulled them through, and yet they're worried about the size of this Philistine army.
Yeah, and you have this giant of a human being, who literally his armor weighs about 125 pounds. That's a lot. And, that we have this, he's described in this 6 cubits and all these things. And those details and those measurements aren't really super clear in our thinking. He's really, really tall. So most people kind of put him between 9 and 10 feet tall. And he's an imposing figure. And this was a typical way, to kind of solve conflicts. Maybe the Philistines themselves had grown weary of the continual conflict, and they have their champion. And they trot out their champion, and just like you said, the perspective of this entire account is horizontal. As we look to Goliath, as we look to the nation, the Philistines and the army, is God going to do what he said he was going to do? And so as you read this, you're kind of looking at that and kind of wondering, I don't know, who's going to beat Goliath? So as we go on, you have the challenger who arises, not just Goliath, but we're introduced or reintroduced to David. And we saw him again, for the first time in chapter 16. Now he comes, and the way he's kind of told in the story, he kind of comes off a little bit like all shucks, like as an errand boy, to bring his brothers.
Just delivering some cheese.
Delivering some food, and Jesse says, hey, if you bring some tokens back just so I know that they're okay. Right. And you get the sense that David is like, what in the world is going on right now? And one of the beautiful parts of this story is, David stands up. And I think biblical narrative is so important because you always listen to what people say, and that helps us understand how the character is being developed. So, what are some of the things that we hear David say as he comes forward? He says, take this cheese, Jesse says. Just kind of look at it. What are some of the things that he says? Men of Israel, verse 25 said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. David says, what shall be done? For the man, verse 26, who kills this Philistine takes away the reproach from Israel. So David is already positioning himself as maybe he's the one that would.
Yeah, well, he recognizes that nobody else is going to come forward at this point. He's like, so they've promised you all of these things, and still nobody's going to do it? And so I think he just gets this realization that nobody else is willing. Like it's me or nobody else. And so I think that's what we're seeing in those last verse 25, 26, 27.
Yeah. And so David does something that's pretty curious. He goes to Saul and says, I'll do it. And we know that David has served at least some time. We're not told exactly how many years are between chapter 16 and chapter 17. Some scholars think anywhere between 6 years, possibly. So it's been some time. But we know that David has served in the court of Saul. He's been a musician, but that's all we know. And that's also, so Saul may not recognize him right away. So David goes out and he's given Saul's armor. So I always think it's pretty interesting. Yeah,
which didn't quite fit, right?
Didn't fit.
Whenever I think back about the armor, you said it was about 125 pounds for Goliath's armor. The chances are David weighed a mere 125 pounds. So this guy's armor weighed as much as David did. And now here we are, David's trying to put on another grown man's armor. And he's still young. He's still just a kid. He hasn't been trained as a warrior and to wear this armor and to battle with it. And he's like, yeah, no, it's not going to work for me.
So then he goes and he takes the 5 smooth stones, puts it in his pouch, and he's got his sling. And so I think the first truth that we really see here is faith was on display for all to see. Faith was on display for all to see. And David was really showcasing his faith. And so, we talked about this, in our previous devotional with me and Caleb, the spies in the land, they demonstrated faith. And the 5 stories that we picked, as you'll see as you kind of go through this series, is that in every situation, faith is really, kind of what's at stake. Who do you trust? Who do you believe? And so David's faith is very obvious.
Yeah, he believed whenever God told him he was going to be the next king. I believe that he believed that was going to happen. Mm-hmm. So the things that happened between then and the time that he would become king, he knew God was going to protect him because he trusted that he was going to be king. And there's so many times, I think, in our own life where we may know God's plan. Maybe he's delivered it to us very easy to see, but whenever there's trial, we still doubt it. We can still doubt what's going to happen. And David didn't doubt. He knew.
Yeah, and I think going back to what exactly is his faith in? Because we've said before, like in our podcast with myself and Caleb and on this devotional series, the object of your faith is the most important thing. So you could have faith in something that's absurd and your faith could be very sincere, but if your object in that faith isn't very good, then your faith really isn't going to be that great. And so for David, his faith and confidence and trust was in God's good word. And I think, again, if you set the context, we're in the territory of Judah. We're in the territory of Israel, which is the promised land. And David says, who are these people that would come against the living God? So absolutely, so faith is on display. Number 2, you see this, and as we look at verses 41 to 49, we'll just kind of paraphrase it, the seemingly insignificant was used by God for all to see.
Yeah.
I love that. I love this part of the story. I think this is what makes the story so gripping. David didn't fit in the armor. He's got the stones. He's insignificant from his brother's perspective.
Yeah, no one was giving him much credit at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he didn't have the right tools to fight.
Right.
So yeah, I love that. He was given up as insignificant, and no one thought much of him. And I think even when they said, "Okay, sure, you can go fight," they were just trying to buy some time.
Right.
I don't really think people had much faith in David.
It doesn't seem that way. Like the narrative doesn't come across that way. It's almost kind of like I get the point that people were, probably fearful of the Philistines, and they see this little shepherd boy, and this he doesn't have any armor on. He's got his sling, and what is this? They don't really know what to make of it.
Yeah.
But what David says is so important, and I know that you probably read this off camera. But looking at verse 45, then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the hosts of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all of this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand.
Amen.
Such a beautiful part of the story.
So beautiful.
And I always regretted in the VeggieTales version that the giant pickle didn't have his head cut off. Okay, let's fast forward here a little bit to this story. I'm glad I made you laugh. All right, so as you go on, David, of course, gets the stone. He puts it into the sling, and then we all know the story. The stone just sinks into the guy's forehead. He falls forward, and victory. And that's the conclusion of the story. So again, we could kind of pause here and just say, as you think about your giants in your land and giants in your life and giants in the armies, that you face, conquer them like David. But like you said, there's a much deeper part of the story. And I think it resonates really with two simple truths. The first one is this: God's king was on display for all to see.
Amen. Yeah, God had anointed David to do something great. He had chosen him for a purpose. And really, David only expected to be king. I mean, I think, I say that. But we know that even in the quiet, even when no one was looking, David trusted God, and he would slay a lion and a bear that just had come into the sheep, and now he had trusted him to slay this giant. And what I found really cool is that not only did David's faith empower him to trust in God and see the power of God on display, but it allowed the entire Israelite army to see God's power on display. And once he defeated Goliath, all of the Israelites were in, and they started chasing down those Philistines.
It's true.
And so, the faith, this one stone, the faith that David had, was able to empower an entire nation to see the power of God.
And if you kind of think of it in the context of the story, Saul was the people's choice. He was head and shoulders above everybody else. He was handsome. He was rugged. Everybody liked him. And where was he? Where was he fighting Goliath? Why was he giving his armor away to David? Well, that armor should have been Saul's, but he willingly gave it away. And so what God is doing in front of the people is he's vindicating and validating his decision for who's going to be king. And it's not going to be in accordance to their perspectives of what greatness is. It's going to be based on what God has decided. And so God's pattern throughout all of Scripture, it seems, is to take that which is insignificant and to make it great. And I think that's going to be something that resonates with all of us. Yeah. I mean, you're a children's director. He
has the power. He strengthens me every single day. And I am just an insignificant girl with a love and desire to share his word with kids. And even the days that I don't feel like I have the energy to do that, he can empower me with that. There's so many obstacles that we each face that he can help us through. But we have to remember that he's the one.
Right.
It's not us defeating our giants.
That's exactly
but it's
right.
God defeating our giants if we allow him.
Yeah.
If we give ourselves up to him to do that through us.
And trust him. And that's what you see in this story.
Yeah.
The central figure is not David.
Right.
The central actor in the whole story, David credits God with it. Yes. And so I think as we think about all of these, how these point ultimately to Christ, you have to say that this is like one giant arrow that points to Jesus. When I was teaching this to teenagers, I would always say David is the little m Messiah who points to the capital M Messiah. David is an anointed one who points to the anointed one who would come and slay the giant of sin and death. And so
That's good stuff, John.
Yeah, I mean, it resonates with me, and it takes, I think, some of the whole emphasis of the story off of what can I do, and it goes back to here's what God did through his anointed king who looks forward to the anointed king. And there are clear differences. David slayed the giant. Jesus allowed himself to be slayed by the giant of death so that he might overcome it. So, any last thoughts before we wrap up?
Not so much. I mean, this is such an amazing story. I do hope that everyone at home is reading these scriptures with your family. Don't let this story just pass you by. What an amazing display of Christ's love and affection and willingness to give himself for us right here. I mean, so many thousands of years ago and before Christ was even born. So that's been the exciting part of this story for me. I will say I've dug in a little deeper than I usually do with kids, and so it's been really exciting for me.
Are you going to teach them that they cut his head off?
Yeah, I'm going to go with. We're going to go deep. This is actually one of our stories for camp.
Awesome.
So this is day 2 at children's camp in just a couple of weeks. And so, they'll learn a little more than maybe the children's camp version that was given to me.
Beautiful, beautiful. Spoiler alert, Hickory wins in the movie Hoosiers. So sorry to tell you that. David overcomes Goliath. I don't remember the other team, though. So hope you've enjoyed this. God bless you, and we look forward to being with you again in the next Summer Classic.
Have a good day.